Hello and welcome to this Southampton Philosophy for Schools explainer video on the ontological argument. So what we're going to do today is look at one of the most famous arguments for the existence of God, and we're going to look at the most prominent version of that argument, have a little think about what it means, and then we're going to talk about whether or not that argument is any good. So let's get started. So the argument in outline, as it's presented by St. Anselm, is as follows. He says, number one, God is a being than which no greater being can be conceived. Such a being exists in the understanding, he says. If such a being existed in the understanding alone, then there would be a greater being which also existed in reality. This is impossible. By this is impossible, he means it's impossible for there to be an even greater being than the greatest possible being which exists in reality. Therefore, a being than which no greater can be conceived exists in reality. Therefore, God exists. Okay, so let's talk about what that argument means. So let's think it through. Anselm asks us to imagine, if we can, the greatest possible being, the being than which no greater can be conceived, right? And he says that the greatest possible being is God. And now he says, but wouldn't it be even better if that being, the greatest being that could be conceived, wasn't merely something that existed in your imagination, but actually existed in reality? And of course, it would be even better for the greatest possible being to exist in reality than for the greatest possible being to exist merely in the imagination. So, he says, whatever is the greatest possible being must exist in reality, and consequently, God must exist in reality. Okay, so let's just talk about some interesting features that this argument has. So the first thing to note is that it's an a priori argument. So it's a kind of argument that can be settled from the armchair. It doesn't require us to go out into the world and see what the world is like, to gather any empirical evidence, to do any empirical investigation. All we need to do to work out whether the argument is true or not is just to sit and think about it. It's also worth noting that it's one of the most famous arguments that you'll ever come across, and it's stimulated an awful amount of discussion and intrigue, because even though lots of people have the intuition that something's not quite right about that argument, it's really quite hard to say exactly what's wrong with it. Okay. So, let's now have a think about whether or not the argument is any good. So, there are three famous objections to this argument, and I want to talk briefly about each of them. So here's the first one. It's called the island parody. Okay, so imagine, if you will, a perfect island. Maybe it's really sunny all the time, maybe there's loads of palm trees, maybe it's got beautiful white sand, maybe it's got really stimulating libraries, whatever it takes. Now, wouldn't it be even more perfect if that island didn't merely exist in your imagination, but also existed in reality? Well, now, following the same reasoning as we followed in the ontological argument, if the most perfect island, the island that is more perfect than the greatest island you can imagine, would be an island that exists in reality, then we're going to have to say that the perfect island, the greatest possible island, the island than which no greater can be conceived, exists in reality. Woohoo! But of course, it probably doesn't. So what this shows us is that something seems to have gone wrong with the ontological argument. But what it doesn't show us is exactly what has gone wrong. So these kinds of parody arguments are interesting in telling us that there must be some kind of mistake with our reasoning, maybe, unless we think it's a bad kind of analogy. But they don't tell us exactly where the mistake in our reasoning is. So they have kind of limited use, but some use, of course. Okay. So the second objection I want to talk about is a little bit more kind of technical, a philosophical objection, and it argues that the ontological argument begs the question. So, what do we mean by begging the question? What we don't mean by begging the question is raising the question, right? So people often mistake the phrase begs the question to mean raising the question. That's not what we mean here. So here we have a technical, philosophical way of thinking about begging the question at hand. And what that means is that an argument which begs the question is one which sets out the thing, which assumes the thing that it sets out to prove. It's an argument that assumes the thing that it sets out to prove. So this handsome chap here on the left is Arthur Schopenhauer, and he argued that by defining God as that than which no greater can be conceived, we implicitly assume that God exists, and that makes our argument invalid. It's a logical fallacy to beg the question because it assumes what it is that we're trying to prove. Okay, so the final argument that I want to talk about, the final objection I want to talk about, is another very famous objection, this time usually associated with Immanuel Kant, and the objection says that existence is not a predicate. What does that mean? Well, predicates are words that refer to properties. So here are some examples. The rose is red. The predicate there is red. It picks out the property redness. The exam is hard. The government is rubbish. Donald Trump exists. Now, that final statement, Donald Trump exists, that seems kind of different from the first three, right? So you might think, and this objection says, that existence is not a predicate. Existence is not the kind of word that picks out a property that an object has, right? It's a different kind of thing. To say that something exists is just a different kind of category than to say that it's red or it's interesting or something like that. Okay. So, properties tell us about the nature of objects. We define an object by appeal to its properties. We might think an object is made up of a collection of its properties. Okay, and once we give a characterization of an object by talking about all of its properties, we might then say something further, which is to say that the object exists or doesn't exist. But it doesn't seem like, so the objection goes, that existence is itself a property of an object. We don't say that the rose is red and beautiful and smelly and existing, right? The fact that the rose exists seems to be some kind of further fact that we say after we've characterized the object. Whether it exists or not is just something that seems to belong to a separate category to the question of what kind of features that the object has. Okay, so those are three very quick objections to the ontological argument. But really, what's nice about this argument is that it's extremely simple. So we, you, us, qua philosophers, can think about this argument ourselves, and we should be able to try to work out whether or not we think it's a good argument, and if not, we can think hard about why not. So I challenge you to do that.